What does the global population collapse mean for America, China, and the world?
I don't want to have a department of government that's trying to influence the way that I think about children.
That's Nicholas Eberstadt, one of the world's leading experts on demography. Today on Switzerland. Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Switzer. Now, if you're anxious about collapsing birth rates, aging societies, China's demographic time bomb, the West's loss of confidence, and the future of civilization, well, who better to address these issues than our guest today, Nicholas Eberstadt. He's the veteran political economist at the Washington-based American Enterprise Institute and author, most recently, of America's Human Arithmetic. That's just out by AEI Press. Well, g'day, Nick. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you so much, Tom.
Well, let's put your depopulation thesis in a global context, and let's put it in the context of who else but Thomas Malthus. Now, he proclaimed his population theories in the late 1700s, and ever since, the conventional wisdom was that the overflow of our species could deplete the planet's resources. And this mindset, as you well know, became increasingly intense in the late 1960s, early 70s, with the publication of Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich's book. It was a best-selling book. It was called The Population Bomb. And this is what he argued. We'll put this on the screen. Quote, "The battle to feed all humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death." Now, Ehrlich was hardly alone in predicting doom and gloom. Here's the Harvard biologist George Wall in 1970, quote, "Civilization will end within 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken to reduce population growth." And then there are other groups like the global think tank, the Club of Rome, the scientist Rachel Carson, the ecologist Barry Commoner, the microbiologist Rene Dubos. And, they all predicted uncontrolled population growth and a blackened, uninhabitable planet within decades. They were spectacularly wrong. Nick, why?
They were wrong because they misunderstood what Homo sapiens is, what we as a species are, and why we are different from all other species on this planet. We are the most adaptable species. We are the most ingenious species. We are the species that can do systematic problem solving. If Paul Ehrlich studied the population biology of insects, that's why he got his tenure at Stanford. If we had been insects, his predictions would have been perfect. This would have happened. We'd have had an overshoot of our resources. But human beings can change their fertility. They have changed their longevity. We've more than doubled our life expectancy. They can create knowledge, change their patterns, and change their resource base. So, since 1968, since the year of the bestseller Population Bomb, the world has more than doubled its population. We today, with more than twice as many humans as in 68, have longer lives for our species, better education, better food, better housing. Per capita global income has almost tripled, as best we can estimate this, and global poverty, the proportion of population in global poverty has dropped from about 50% to under 10%. If we were insects or red deer, this couldn't have happened. It could only happen with humans.
And yet, there is population decline or depopulation that is rapidly happening. You've spent more than several decades on this subject. How do you account for that, given that life expectancy has improved dramatically. Our lifestyle, our living standards have improved dramatically. You mentioned global poverty coming down dramatically. How do you square that with depopulation?
Well, as I mentioned, Tom, we are the most adaptable of all species. We do not breed up to the limits of our resources. We choose. We choose and we adapt. And for 3 generations, the world's fertility level on average has been falling pretty constantly. For whatever reasons, people all around the world have been choosing to have fewer children. If you go through the social science rigmarole, there are, you know, 2 dozen different theories on why this has happened. The most obvious correspondence is between the number of children that women say they want and the number of births on average in that society. It's almost a perfect one-for-one correspondence. Again, this shows that we're not rabbits, we're not robots. We choose, there's human agency. The question of why we are choosing so few children, not enough in many parts of the world now, to maintain long-term population stability. That's a really deep and profound metaphysical question, but it doesn't have to do with the old arguments about human beings being kind of bound to act like other animals.
And let's remember the global population has not fallen since the Black Death. So we're talking about the mid 1300s when the bubonic plague devastated Eurasia, killing something like 60% of the population, right?
Yeah. In the past, depopulations have not been a whole lot of fun because they haven't been driven by the choice to have fewer children. They've been driven by exigence, by an inability to prevent mortality catastrophes, whether it's, as you just mentioned, whether it's a plague, whether it's a famine, whether it's some sort of other pestilence or a war or an upheaval that shatters civilization or existence. Uh, in the past, people have been terrified by depopulation because it's been the four horsemen. Well, right now, we're richer than we've ever been before, and we're choosing to have fewer children. The world population is still growing on the whole, even though East Asia and Europe are already starting to depopulate, and other places are on that path. It's going to be a very different sort of long-term population decline if it's one that's chosen voluntarily in the context of affluence.
And Nick, you've warned that, we don't yet understand how societies function when childlessness becomes widespread. What worries you about a world where large numbers of people never become parents or grandparents?
Well, there are certain sorts of material, economic, administrative policy questions, and then there are really the deep metaphysical, spiritual, ethical questions of life. Um, on the former, as I said, I think human beings are remarkably adaptable animals, and we'll be able to figure out how to continue to make the world bountiful and plentiful and to continue material progress, even if a very large share of people in the world end up being childless. Uh, it'll be a pretty it'll be a pretty formidable adjustment, but we've adjusted to a lot of things since we lived in caves. Um, What's harder for me to wrap my head around is the significance of a transition to a world in which a very high proportion of people do not have children and do not continue choose not to continue their lineage, let's call it. Um, w- there are more people on Earth now than there ever have been, and yet already you look around, it seems like people are so lonely. It seems like there's
Yeah,
so much loneliness now.
yeah.
There's a there's a hunger for meaning that I kind of sense will only be accentuated if we move into a world where people are if you want to call it that, voting with their feet not to continue.
Yeah, it seems to me that in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, there was a lot of doom and gloom about rapid population growth. But 50 or
There
so
was
years later, we're embracing doom and gloom as well because of depopulation. Let me just test your thesis. Japan, a country that you've studied closely for many decades, Nick, that has been shrinking demographically for decades. It's very clear. Yet Japan remains prosperous, orderly, and politically stable. Why shouldn't we assume that the ultra low fertility in Japan and indeed across Northeast Asia, you wrote about this in Foreign Affairs magazine a few years ago, increasingly across the developed world, why can't we just assume that that ultra low fertility in these countries will follow the relatively benign path as Japan?
um, there will be some necessary adjustments that will have to happen in Japan as well, but in all depopulating countries, because up until now, we've arranged and incentivized our social arrangements, our economic arrangements, our public finances to profit off of population growth. I'll give you the most obvious example, Tom. We've got in most of the world, we have most of the affluent world where such systems exist. We've got national pension systems that are sort of pyramid schemes. They're called pay as you go, and people who are working now are taxed to finance the retirement of current retirees. When there were relatively few old people and a lot of younger people, it was a great system because you could have relatively low pension taxes. But when the population pyramid flips and you've got as many retirees as workers or more retirees than workers, you can't keep doing that or you're going to bankrupt yourself. It has to change. Of course, it can change. But my point is that not just with public finances, but with the way that corporations plan about products and product lines and their human resources, with the way that investors look at the profitability of different sorts of possible considerations or situations, with the ways that families work, with the way that individuals work and saving money for the future. All sorts of things have to change from the way we've been doing them to profit off of a shrinking and aging world. I think, Tom, that the challenges of adjustment for a shrinking and aging world, they can all be made, but they're going to be a lot bigger than the sorts of challenges people talk about with climate change. They're going to be a
Okay,
lot
but there are
bigger.
some critics who would argue, and we'll talk about the climate argument very soon, but they would argue that you're overstating the fertility crisis. Some, and they're mainly on the left, argue that this is a bogus argument. And their argument is that it's ultimately cheaper to care for the elderly than to raise children. That's what they would argue.
Well, I mean, I suppose you say the cheapest thing of all is not to have humans, and if you don't have any births, you'll get there faster than if you have some births. But if you if you're going to, I would say that the way that you see a path towards continuing prosperity and material advance in a world where the human numbers are dwindling and populations are getting grayer is to increase the health and skills of living humans, not worried so much about like trying to raise birth rates. Nobody's ever figured out a pronatal population policy that's really had any appreciable long-term effect, at least as yet. You try to increase the what we call you increase the value of the human beings who are here, and then have a business climate that will unlock the value of those human beings. And you also put a lot of effort on knowledge creation so that you can increase productivity for the people who are actually here. You know, People are living longer than ever before. They can work longer. You mentioned Japan. One of the, I think, really heartening things about Japan, and this and makes your point, Japan's population has been shrinking for over a decade and a half, but this year, Japan's workforce, its paid workforce, is bigger than it's ever been before,
Wow.
despite shrinking, right? Why? Because more older people are healthy and want to work longer because of Abenomics for the
Hmm.
late Shinzo Abe, with more
Hmm.
women in the workforce. Uh, it's the constraints of population change are secondary to the potential that we can unlock in, building humanity's potential.
Okay. Next form of criticism, and it gets back to the climate change argument. There is a growing argument, especially among the climate activists, green economists. You find this attitude rife among the millennials and Gen Z, and they say that population decline, slower growth, they're not a problem, but they're actually a solution to environmental stress. Again, your response, Nick.
I'm not a population biologist. I'm not an ecologist. I don't understand the climate change models. They're way they're way more complex than looking at population, which is a closed system, as same number of people next year, 1 year older, net of births, deaths, and migration. That said, we have to note that for over 200 years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the long-term trend for resource costs has been down. It's like the stock market, doesn't go down every year, it bounces around. But food costs have steadily come down. Other
Mm,
resource costs have steadily come down. If you're trained the way I am as an economist and you hear that real costs of something are coming down, that tells me that they're becoming more plentiful, that in some meaningful sense they're becoming more available, less scarce. This despite the huge jump in the number of people in the world. What this tells me, or at least what I interpret this to mean, is that we're coming up with problem-solving technological advances that help us to make new resources more available. And with the increase in with the increased trend towards a knowledge economy, knowledge doesn't put a big strain on the earth. This is all what's going on up here. So my own impression is that the future of economic development is going to be human intensive, not resource
yes,
intensive, and it's
yes.
not going to put the strain on the earth that many people
Yeah,
fear.
you've made this point time and again, and we'll return to this later on when we address America's problems. But just another form of criticism, Nick, is really the question of immigration, because as you well know, migrants have helped ward off depopulation trends that threaten wealthy countries. But as you also know, across the Western world, we've seen a real populist backlash against not just legal immigration, sorry, not just illegal immigration, tough border protection policy to keep out illegal immigration, but there's backlash now against legal immigration. And that backlash, as you know, helps explain the rise of Donald Trump in the United States, Nigel Farage in Britain, Pauline Hanson here in Australia, um, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, the ADF in Germany, Le Pen in France, and so on and so forth, all across continental Europe. And yet, all these societies, as we've discussed, face serious fertility decline. So, I suppose the question here is, should Western countries think about immigration less in civilizational terms, as MAGA Republicans, for example, do, and more explicitly as a selective human capital strategy? Nick.
Uh, As you know, Tom, I'm a fan of legal immigration for my own country. I don't think I've got standing to tell other countries what they should be doing. And I realize that all around the world, there's a big difference in countries, in that some are more successful in welcoming newcomers and turning them into loyal and productive citizens than other countries are. That's just a reality. I mean, there's a big difference between the USA or between Australia and Japan or South Korea. And Japan and South Korea, both very successful post-war societies. Um, I'd look at it. I'd look at it this way. I think there's a big area of win-win that's possible for would-be migrants from sending countries and would-be receiving countries. Um, but it's not an unlimited space. It's a specific space because the newcomers have to have the motivation and the skills to assimilate and to become productive members of the welcoming society. Um,
Well, this is the point I was going to make because, Nick, a lot of the supporters of MAGA in America, Farage in Britain, and Le Pen and the IDF in France and Germany, respectively, they'd say that there's a danger here in relying too heavily on immigration to offset population decline because, in their judgment, that would just erode social community trust and that could undermine the very cohesion that prosperous aging societies depend upon. That's what they would say to you.
well, it's a national sovereignty question. I mean, for a democracy, for a sovereign democracy, a sovereign country should be able to choose who becomes a new member of their country. I mean, I think as long as we have a Westphalian system of nation states, the presupposes that you get to choose who comes into your country and who doesn't. So I think that part is pretty straightforward. If you want to have a different system in which there are global empires or something else, Volkswanderung, we had those, but wasn't very civilized at the time. I suppose you could do that too. But if you're going to have nation states are going to have the sovereignty to choose who becomes a member of the club and who isn't a member of the club. Uh, Probably different countries and different societies have different capacities here. I can tell you that in the United States, it was a terrible mistake for the Biden administration to more or less have an open border experiment on the Mexico-US border because, among other things, our public sentiment for migration had been quite positive, and this completely poisoned it and made huge distrust because the wellspring of illegal migrants coming to the United States were breaking the rules. They seemed to be taking advantage of gaming the system. They seemed to be a burden on the public fisc, and tax-paying citizens don't like that. No surprise.
No, no. Well, let's moving on from immigration and talk about other public policies that governments can put in place to address low fertility and declining population. Now, around the world, as you well know, and I think of Orban's Hungary, for example, governments are spending enormous sums of tax dollars to try to raise birth rates, yet the results have been mixed. Is there anything policymakers, in your judgment, can do realistically to reverse fertility decline, or is it largely beyond the reach of the state, Nick?
I hope it is beyond the reach of the state, and I say that for this reason, because as my own assessment is that the closest correspondence between the, the variable that is closest to fertility change is changing desire for children on the part of women. It's probably true for men too, but we don't survey the men. But if if the real important way that you can kind of move the needle is by changing what people think about kids, I don't want to have a department of government that's trying to influence the way that I think about children. That's going to be hugely intrusive. It sounds a little bit too much like the People's Republic of China in
Yeah,
reverse, if you see what I mean.
yeah. And this is a case where your social conservatism might clash with your economic liberalism, Nick.
Well, ultimately, I think that we'll find, I mean, we'll find uh, that the truth in the social conservative argument is that in the United States case, that something like a great awakening, a great change in religiosity, would have a potential impact on
Hmm.
family, on births, but it would be kind of terrifying to think that there was a department of religious awakening. It sounds a little bit too much like Tehran.
Yeah, sure. Well, talking about beyond the reach of the state, that brings us to who else but communist China. Now, the one China policy in China, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think it lasted from the late 70s until early 2016. In fact, I think January 2026, this month, marks the decade since the end of the one China policy in China.
One
Um,
child policy, yeah.
one child policy in sorry, one child policy in China. Um, Very
Yeah, they still
consequential.
like the one China policy.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have an episode on that soon enough. But it's been 10 years since the end of the one child policy in China. But what's the latest population projections for China during the next century, Nick?
Well, as you know, Tom, the overlords of population policy in China believed that they could fine-tune births through their population control policies, kind of the way that like they were ranchers or something, like
Mm,
they had like this animal farm. But then they found out that when they suspended the one-child restriction, instead of, calibrating an increase in births, there's been an unstoppable birth collapse. And since 2016, as best we can tell from Chinese figures, the the total births have dropped by more than 50%.
wow.
Marriages have also collapsed. We're going to get the latest birth numbers this month and maybe next week. Um, but all of the expectation is that it's continuing. And what seems to have happened, this is my interpretation, but what seems to have happened is there seems to have been a collapse in confidence and a rise in pessimism. And this really unusual end of optimism about the future, I think is related to the regime. It's related to like having the government kind of like on the throat of the family, and it's related to uh, kind of like the shattering of the family, which unfortunately was an unintended consequence of this policy.
Well, this is all very interesting because there is a school of thought, and we had on this program recently, Nick, Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, whom you know.
Sure.
And his argument is that China is a country pumped up on nationalism. But this pessimism thesis of yours contradicts that. But back to these low birth rates. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'm not sure it totally contradicts it. I mean, if
Right.
I were the government, if I were the government, I was facing a tsunami of pessimism, what would I
Uh
do?
huh.
I'd probably try to be pushing the nationalism
Yeah,
button.
right. Good point. Okay. But back to the issue of these declining birth rates, and they really are declining. I mean, 50% is extraordinary. But in response, Nick, as I'm sure you're aware, the Chinese government has brought in a new 13% sales tax on contraceptives. And this is as it's trying to, stop the birth rate falling. I mean, could those kind of measures by the CCP, could they help boost birth rates in China?
It's laughable. It's laughable. It's like, let's say there's like a big windstorm coming at you, and you were going, it's like that. You know, it absolutely inconsequential. I mean, one of the chilling things about the Chinese regime's population policies is what they revealed about their lack of understanding of their own people. mean, the one-child policy was put in place because they thought their own people were heedlessly procreating and had no interest in their own children's economic future. Um, they kept it on for decades and decades because they thought that the people were still peasants, and if they took the policy back, they'd go back to having 5 children. Once they took the policy into suspension, they thought that they were going to be able to calibrate it. They were wrong every time, and they're wrong about this as well, I think.
Okay. But this program tries to be fair to our critics because it just keeps the conversation lively. But
Sure.
the Chinese government might say, and I'm sure there are CCP, Chinese Communist Party officials, who would argue that, they insisted on the one child policy for 3 to 4 decades and they enforced it. Could the CCP, the brutal dictatorship that it is, authoritarian regime that it is, could the CCP enforce a two-child policy? Nick,
Very interesting question, Tom. I mean, the hypothesis would look something like this, I think, that um, in the past, police states with bayonets have used government power to lower the birth rate, but they've never been able to use government power to raise the birth rate. But China is a newer, more sophisticated authoritarian state. And with, for example, the social credit system, which they will have 1,000 different little nudges that they can be pushing people in the direction of having more kids. They say, "Oh, Miss Wong, we'd love for you to be able to have an apartment, but you're unmarried." Or, "Oh, Mr. Lee, you want to be able to rent this car, but you don't have any children." You know, through 1,000 little pushes like that, they may think that they can incentivize pronatal policy. Um, if they can, they haven't done a very good job of it yet. Let's just put it that way.
yeah, sure. So just to clarify your line then, without meaningful efforts that address this gender inequity, we're not going to see meaningful rebound or recovery in Chinese fertility. I get that. But again, the CCP officials will come back to you, Nick, and they'd say there's technology, AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, automation that will offset population decline. Question: can't technology save China's demographic problem, especially if it's increasingly a trendsetter in technology? Nick,
It's an excellent question, and it's not just for China. I mean,
no. Right.
in a potentially depopulating world, AI is a productivity multiplier, and it should be able to increase the productivity of the Chinese economy, of other economies as well. What I don't think we understand enough yet about this really rapidly developing emerging technology, AI. My guess is it's going to look different 5 years from now from today, and 20 years from now, it may be unrecognizable to people like us, which is just to say how fast things may change. Um, in the past, when you have a new technological innovation that's really, disruptive, exciting, however you want to put it. There tends to be a kind of a bifurcation. The people with skills who can kind of, if you will, grab the lantern and hold it, their productivity goes way up and their incomes go way up. The people who can't do that tend to get displaced. So it is possible in China and in other future depopulating countries that you could have an AI situation where productivity was going up for the people who were using it at the same time that there was, even in a shrinking society, big displacement of labor. And how all of that gets sorted out is, an important question for the future, but I don't think it's one we can
Okay.
answer yet.
So if technology and contraception taxes or a two-child policy, if none of these measures can really boost China's fertility. What about immigration? We mentioned it earlier in the context of Western countries. Now, hardly any Westerner would want to migrate to China. But surely there are many people in the global south who would welcome migration to China. So why can't the CCP just liberalize immigration to help fix their fertility problem?
The question would be whether they judge that the foreigners, the newcomers, can be assimilated as loyal and productive Chinese. And I mean, China is a sort of a multi-ethnic empire. And the reason they've got all of the different dialects is because the unified Chinese state moved out and expanded and absorbed different peoples. So it does have a history of assimilating people after a particular sort of fashion. Um, whether and also nowadays, uh, in Vietnam, North Korea, there's small numbers of women from abroad who I don't know how they come in. I don't know if it's, licit or illicit. They come in as, wives. Some of them may have been, pirated. Um, there's some there's small numbers of, sub-Saharan African, traders and merchants down in Canton and Guangzhou, but the problem for China is that if you've got 1.4 billion people at the moment, uh, the scale of migration that you'd need from abroad to, again, to move the needle, you'd be
Mhm.
talking about tens and hundreds of millions of people. You basically would have to kind of like, you'd have to unify with Indonesia to make
Yeah.
any big difference.
Okay. Well, keeping with immigration, but adapting it to the United States. Obviously, the United States remains the top dog. It's the world leader, and not just because of the greenback, the world's reserve currency, and its splendid higher education sector, but also because of immigration. However, the administration in Washington, the Trump administration, is slashing immigration. To what extent will that make America's depopulation problem worse?
It's hard to say how much of what we saw in 2025 was a one-time reaction to the really abnormal situation of over the previous 4 years, and how much it's a new normal. I'm not sure that I can tell you that yet. Um, it's possible that 2025 possible that 2025, when we get all the numbers in, will be the first year in 3 generations when, net migration goes negative in our country. Um, the US, um, the US birth rate is quite far below replacement, higher than in Europe, but quite far below replacement. And the Congressional Budget Office anticipates that deaths will exceed births in the United States by 2030. That's just 4 years from now. So if the United if the United States um, if the United States does not want to rely upon immigration to increase the size, let's say, of its labor market, um, it had better be prepared to utilize its own human resources in a better way than it is doing right now. Because, as you know, over the course of the 21st century, we've seen a lot of strange new dysfunctions in the USA. I call them the new misery. And we're not as well prepared for a potential depopulation in the United States today, ironically enough, as we would have been 25 years ago.
Yeah, and that brings us to primary school education and in high school. Your research, correct me if I'm wrong, am I right in saying it's concluded that the total number of people with some form of higher education in China surpassed that of the US around 2014? That's higher education. Now, the question I suppose here is, and the evidence is pretty clear, I think, could falling maths and literacy threaten to topple America's status as a trendsetter on education when by the time they get to higher education? Nick?
The the big higher education explosion in China is a kind of an interesting, phenomenon because it's a crash program that was commanded by the government at the end of the 1990s, and like many crash programs, um, it achieves some of its objectives, but then it has big unintended consequences. I think what was accomplished by this generation of command increase in higher education, they probably got I'm going to make this number up, but it's, you get what I'm getting at. A couple of 100,000 really excellent, elite higher education slots that they wouldn't have had before. That's meaningful. But on the tail end, there are scores and scores of millions of young men and women who have gotten garbage degrees in this, kind of like illusion of higher education that's come out, who have university tastes but not university skills. That's why there is this phenomenon of the urban youth unemployment that we hear about in China today. With congratulations, Mr. Zhang, you got your degree. Now you can deliver lunch to the office over there. This is also having an unintended effect, I think,
Mm.
that feeds right into the growth of the pessimism that I
Yes,
mentioned.
yes.
So,
But back to the United States, though, just say the Trump
yeah,
administration and Congress continue to make cuts to universities. This is the former IMF chief economist, Simon Johnson. And his argument is that attacks on the higher education institutions like Harvard and Columbia and elsewhere, they're silent killers for the economy. This is the quote, and we'll put this on the screen. The decline in investments in science is going to impact economic growth and security. We're going to get less scientific output in this country, and China will do more. Now, that's the former IMF economist,
yeah,
Simon Johnson. Your response to Simon Johnson, Nick?
I think that's a really valid concern. I think that's a totally valid concern. Um, the U.S. The U.S. higher education, university and corporate research nexus is a wonder of the modern world. And it all feeds into the U.S. entrepreneurial capabilities because we've got this special sauce, it seems, in the United States, where we can kind of like translate these technological possibilities into these startup companies that kind of like change the world. So absolutely, if we're going to succeed in the future, we have to have the research and development capability to do that. And in my view, that involves attracting talent from abroad as well. I mean, of course, we want to optimize our own domestic talent, but the United States has done very well by inviting foreign talent.
Okay. Well, cheer us up though, because if we do cut immigration substantially and there are further serious cuts to higher education, you've got the falling fertility rates, even in America. You've got rising debt, which could ultimately affect the value of the greenback. I mean, the US spends more on servicing its debt than spending on defense. You don't need me to tell you about the very real, deep political polarization in Washington and across the country. And yet, and we'll conclude on this note, you remain cautiously optimistic about America. Why?
Um, um, Americans are human beings. They can adapt too. And we've got a we've gotten into a lot of bad habits over the course of the 21st century. Some of them are new bad habits, but um, I would say, as I've argued in the past, sometimes the United States gets into historical ruts. We're in one of them now. I don't think that you just predict this out in a linear way. Despite all of the U.S. problems, the United States remains the most affluent society in the world. It still has the most productive entrepreneurial system in the world. It's got it has also the capability to change its directions. Sometimes we need a little bit of a wake-up call for this to happen. I'd like to see it occur before we get that wake-up call, but there's still, I think, boundless potential in the U.S.
Well, that is a good way to conclude our program, Nick. And one thing is very clear from this discussion and decades of your scholarship is that collapsing birth rates may well be the biggest challenge of our era, not just in the United States and China, but all across the world, with the exception of sub Saharan Africa. which you've talked about at length in other podcasts. Nick, let me say you are in many respects an ideal guest for our new program. You're intellectually sound in style and substance, and your scholarship is often quoted by policymakers and politicians. So it's been great to have you on, and I suspect that this exchange on YouTube will age well. After all, demography does not date quickly, and the fertility decline continues to worsen. Again, the new book is called America's Human Arithmetic. It's published by AEI Press. Nicholas is from the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Nick, always great to be with you, mate.
It's always a delight to talk with you, Tom. Thank you so much.